heard of it? Have you ever heard of, before it was called Candlemas Day, it was called the Feast of the Presentation.
I don't know if I've heard that.
Okay, well that's the main part. Okay. Now here's where I stop and I tell everybody the same thing. I can explain what it is, where it came from and everything in a matter of a few seconds. But there's a religious connection with it, so I just need your okay.
Mm-hmm.
You all right? Yeah. Okay. Out of over 20,000 people, I've only had 3 people that said no. And I could tell it without that, but I'm jumping over the first part of the story. So anyway, this goes back to the birth of Jesus 2,000 years ago. 40 days after his birth, from December 25th, he was presented at the temple by a fellow named Simeon. They called that the Feast of the Presentation. Now, 40 days after December 25th is February 2nd. And February 2nd is the exact midpoint of winter. It's the halfway point between winter and spring. So that's where the date came from. Later on, when the Romans got a hold of the holiday, they would take their burnt down, here's the way it was the same holiday, but they would take their burnt down candles from home, because they were still, and take them to the church and exchange for fresh ones, because there were still 2 more months of, long winter nights left. So they would take their candles, they would exchange them, get fresh candles, and then they had a candlelit ceremony down the street. They would light these candles, walk up and down the street with this candlelit ceremony, and the flame was to represent Jesus being the light of the earth. Now that's all the deep, and then there was a big feast after. That's all the deeper I get into it, but that explains what Candlemas Day is. They call that Candlemas because of the candles on the house. They don't practice it in this country anymore. Something to do with, if you're Catholic, you would recognize a Saint Blaise and blessing of the throat, crossing the candles on the throat. That's what they do on that day now. But in Mexico and Central America, they still do it like they did 2,000 years ago. Because when I talk to those people, they know exactly what I'm talking about. And they still walk up and down the street and have the feast. They haven't changed it. They still do it like that. So anyway, later on, when the Roman legion soldiers, when they were on their northward conquest, they went up into the British Isles. Now, at that time, that whole land mass, that whole island was, that's England, Scotland, and Wales now. That was just pagans and Druids. That's who lived in there then. And they had a ceremony they were doing around that first part of February, around that midwinter point, where it had something to do with honoring a Celtic lady and the upcoming spring and all that, because they did that for all the seasons. And the only reason I even bring it up is because I've had 5 people here that have asked me if Groundhog Day is based on a pagan ceremony. Here's what I tell them. No. Although we have a fire in back of that red building over there, it starts at 3 a.m. on Groundhog Day. We're not dancing around it with torches, chanting, and then there's no sacrifices going on. No, we're not pagans, and Phil's not a pagan. So I get that out of the way. Well, when the Roman legions crossed over the channel there, they probably crossed at Calais. I can't find it, I've researched it. But that's the closest point from mainland Europe to the British Isles, is Calais. I think it's only 9 miles. It's not very far. And they were rowing boats, so they're going to take the shortest route possible. Well, if they did cross there, they would have skirted the Netherlands and just went through the southern part of the Netherlands, went up through Belgium and into Germany. When they got into Germany, those folks were mainly farmers, like all of our ancestors were. Mine were in Scotland. And in Scandinavia, that's where my people came from, was across North Sea there. But the farmers in Germany had a weather ceremony they were doing where they would watch different animals about that midwinter point. Now, if you live in the woods or spend a lot of time in the woods, around that time of year, you can tell by the way the animals act. And they thought if a hedgehog came out of its burrow around that midpoint of winter, around Candlemas Day, if it was a bright sunny day, the sun would cause them to cast a shadow. They thought he would see that shadow, get scared, perceiving it as being a predator, and run back into his underground burrow and stay in there. Well, they thought that must also mean winter's going to be longer because he's not coming back out. If it was cloudy and overcast like today, there are no shadows. So they thought if he came out on a day like this, he wouldn't be scared because there's no shadow to scare him. This is where the shadow comes into the whole story. So they thought he would stay out, and they thought, well, that must mean that winter's going to be over and spring's on the way. Saying that goes like this, that ties right into that. If Candlemas Day, February 2nd, if Candlemas Day be sunny and bright, winter shall bring a second flight to winters. On to winter. If Candlemas Day be cloudy and rain, winter shall not come again. Early spring. And that's the whole premise behind Groundhog Day. Wow. If you ever forget, just remember sunshine, shadow, he's hiding, on to winter. No shadow, he stays out. Early spring. Sounds German. Well, Clymer heard about what these people were doing, and he thought it sounded like a good idea. So this is when Punxsutawney got involved in it. More than 134 years ago, on a ridge 3 miles south of here. Sir, do you know where the town of Rossiter's at? You know where the town of Rossiter's at? Okay, Canoe Ridge is above it. That's where they first had it. It was on Canoe Ridge. I live a mile from there, but I don't know the exact spot, but that's where they first had it. Why out there, I have no idea. Somebody probably owned land out there, because back then there wouldn't have been anything. There's still not very much on Canoe Ridge, mostly trees and fields. Well, that's where they were having it, and they called it the Punxsutawney Weather Works shortly after they changed it to the Canoe Ridge Weather Works. And about 2 years later, they added in Gobbler's Knob at the Canoe Ridge Weather Works. Because we have a lot of wild turkeys around. I know I have them in my yard all the time. But, and a male turkey is a gobbler. So they must have had them up on the ridge. And one of the guys must have said, let's call it Gobbler's Knob at the Canoe Ridge Weatherworks. Sounds good. The groundhog's first name wasn't Phil, though. It was Breer or Briar Groundhog. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Uncle Remus books.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some of the characters in those books, and that was about 10, within the
Briar
10-year
Rabbit.
time period. Yeah. Briar Rabbit, Briar Fox, and Briar Bear were in those books. Well, these early groundhog guys, you know, would have had children probably, more than likely, and there weren't a lot of children's books back then, so all the kids were probably reading those Uncle Remus books, you know, with Briar Rabbit, Briar Fox, and Briar Bear in. And I think that's where they got the idea. I can't find for sure, but it's in the right time period. It makes common sense, you know. That's why I'm certain, but that's what I'm going with anyway, until somebody proves me wrong or I find it out. Yeah, but that's, I think I'm right on that. So anyway, they stayed out there until about, well, they were still there at the turn of the century, but Clymer Freese, that newspaper editor, he thought up a better name, a much better name, and he declared in our hometown newspaper that the groundhog's official name was to be Punxsutawney Phil, seer of seers, sage of sages, prognosticator of prognosticators, weather prophet extraordinaire. That's what they say on Groundhog Day when they're reading the scroll. I had a couple guys from Germany here a couple weeks ago, and the older guy thought I was saying when they were reading the squirrel. His son was laughing so hard he couldn't hardly get it out of his mouth to tell me what was going on. But he thought I was saying he unwound the squirrel. Squirrel.